Hello class, the topic of today's video is Sir Philip Sidney. This portrait of Sidney is an 18th or 19th century copy of a portrait that was made in 1576, I believe, and that portrait is now in the National Portrait Gallery in London. I used the copy because I could get a better resolution for this presentation. I love the look. I love the fashion statement here with the lace ruff and the armored throat piece or gorget. Suggests the duality of Sidney's career, I think. So because Sidney's sonnet sequence, what we're reading, Astrophil and Stella, is to some degree, and I want to be really careful here not to overstate this point, but it is to some degree a commentary on his private love life and his position at court in the early 1580s, I think it's valuable to take a look at his immediate social milieu, and in particular, the tangled relationship between two prominent Elizabethan families, Sidney's family, the Dudleys, and the Devereux. We'll start with the Devereux. We'll begin with Walter Devereux. He was at one point Viscount Hereford, but he was awarded the title Earl of Essex in 1572 for his role in suppressing the Northern Rebellion of 1569. This was an insurrection of Catholic nobles in the north of England who supported Mary Queen of Scots' claim to the English throne. And as a reward for his role in suppressing that rebellion, he was granted this title, the Earl of Essex. So to prove his worthiness of this new title, he immediately organized a military expedition to Ireland, where Sidney's aunt, Lady Anne Sidney, was the wife of the current Lord Deputy of Ireland, Sir William Fitzwilliam. Walter was married to a woman named Lettice Knowles. She would die in 1631. She survives everyone. 1634. She would survive everyone in this story. By the early 1570s, she was rumored to be having an affair with Sidney's uncle, Robert Dudley, the first Earl of Leicester. So we'll put the Dudleys up here. There is Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. He was a favorite of Queen Elizabeth and just a very influential member of her Privy Council, or sort of her cabinet, her closest advisors. She was almost certainly, that is, Queen Elizabeth was almost certainly in love with Robert Dudley. And when Dudley's wife, Amy, died in 1560, she fell down the stairs, and many at the time suspected this was there was foul play involved in this. After that accident, there was talk of marriage, of Robert's marriage to the Queen, something that she encouraged. Elizabeth's political circumstances, however, ultimately prevented that marriage from happening, but she remained intensely jealous of Robert and kept him close to her for the remainder of his life. He later served as general of English forces in the Low Countries in the Netherlands, assisting Protestant Dutch rebels to achieve their independence from Catholic Spain. And he was joined there by his nephew, Sir Philip Sidney, in 1585. And Sidney would die there. So there is Robert's older sister, Mary Dudley. She was a highly educated woman. She was fluent in French, Italian, and Latin, and also served at the court of Queen Elizabeth as lady-in-waiting. And she married Sir Henry Sidney in 1551. We'll get his picture up. There he is, Sir Henry Sidney. So by the late 1550s, Henry Sidney was deeply involved in the English colonization of Ireland. And by the 1560s, he was Lord Deputy, and he served 2 terms in that position on either side of his brother-in-law, William Fitzwilliam's tenure as Lord Deputy of Ireland. And he was eventually succeeded by Lord Arthur Grey, under whom Edmund Spenser would serve. Henry and Mary would have 7 children, Philip being the oldest. There's Philip Sidney, and then his sister, and Mary, and their daughter Mary. She would later marry Henry Herbert II, Earl of Pembroke, in 1577, and she would become an incredibly important patron of poets, as well as being a poet in her own right. After Sidney's death, she became the de facto executor of Sidney's literary estate, and the texts that we have today are largely owing to her care in preserving and handling Sidney's manuscripts. So back over to the Devereux side, William and Lettice had 4 children, I believe, who survived into adulthood, of whom 2 are relevant to this story. The first is Robert Devereux, who would become the 2nd Earl of Essex after his father's death. He would also become the Queen's 2nd favorite after Dudley's death in 1588. He would occupy an influential seat on her Privy Council. He would command her naval forces in England's war with Spain. But what's relevant to the story of Philip Sidney is his older sister, Penelope Devereux, who was at one point engaged to Philip Sidney. So Sidney had befriended her father, Walter Devereux, in 1575, and likely traveled with him to Ireland that same year. Walter was so impressed by Sidney, and perhaps also Sidney's wealth, he promised the hand of his 12-year-old daughter in marriage. But not long after reaching this agreement, Walter became ill with dysentery, and he died in 1576. And perhaps due to Robert Dudley's affair with Walter's wife, Lettice Knowles, and lingering conspiracy theories regarding the death of his first wife, Amy, back in 1560, rumors circulated that Dudley may have poisoned Devereux to get him out of the way. And these rumors were, in fact, investigated by Sir Henry Sidney, who was Lord Deputy of Ireland at the time. But Sir Henry's investigation concluded that there was no foul play involved in Walter Devereux's death, supposedly. So 2 years later, Lettice and Robert married, and Queen Elizabeth was not happy about this, but there wasn't a whole lot she could do about it either. After Walter Devereux's death, the proposed marriage between Philip and Penelope Devereux fell apart. They would not see each other again until the early 1580s, and by that time, Penelope was engaged to a man named Robert Rich, and they were married in 1581. Penelope was then 18 years old. This marriage, Penelope's marriage to Robert Rich, proved to be a disaster, unhappy from the very start. It was a marriage that Penelope herself apparently did not want, and she would later have a very public and embarrassing love affair with a gentleman named Charles Blount, which would ultimately lead to her divorce from Rich in 1605, and then she married Blount the following year. But because of the divorce, her children with Blount were never legitimized. Meanwhile, Sidney married a woman named Frances Walsingham. In 1583, she was 16 years old. She was the daughter of the Queen's Secretary of State, Frances Walsingham. And then 3 years later, after their marriage, Sidney died fighting against the Spanish forces in the Low Countries, and we'll talk more about that a little bit. So after his death, Robert Devereux, a few years later, married Sidney's widow, and they remained married until 1601, when Robert, he had a fallout with the Queen over a really sort of badly botched military campaign in Ireland. He was arrested and then was caught plotting her overthrow and had his head chopped off. So that ended, obviously, his marriage to Frances Walsingham. So the mother of Sidney's one-time fiancé married Sidney's uncle, and her son married Sidney's widow. So that's odd. Robert Dudley died in 1588, probably from cancer. The Queen was devastated by this news, but this means that none of the men in this story survived the reign of Queen Elizabeth. Whereas Lettice Knowles, she lived into the Caroline period, which is incredible. It would have put her in her 90s. So we'll take a little time to look in more detail at Sidney's life. This portrait, in fact, all the portraits of the younger generation in the previous slide were painted by a wonderful Renaissance portrait painter named Nicholas Hilliard. He would paint these tiny little portraits on playing cards. They're very, very delicate, very finely done. This one, they're not sure that it's Philip Sidney. This portrait is in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and it is tentatively Philip Sidney. I'm going to accept that identification for the purposes of this presentation, and we're going to do a little chronology of Sidney's life now. So he was born in 1554 to Sir Henry Sidney and Mary Dudley at Penshurst Place in the Weald of Kent. The Weald of Kent, that might be familiar to you. That's the setting of Spencer Shepherd's calendar. There's a picture of Penshurst Place. Still stands today, quite beautiful. And in 1568, he enters Corpus Christi College in Oxford, but leaves after 3 years without taking a degree, and he leaves mainly to travel. He travels to France as part of an embassy to finalize an alliance against Catholic Spain, and while there, he stays in Paris with the Secretary of State and future father-in-law, Francis Walsingham. I think his daughter Frances would have been a little girl at this time. And while there, Sidney witnesses the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. This was a massive spasm of violence, anti-Protestant violence in France, and Catholic mobs attacked known Protestants, dragged them out into the street, murdered them. Supposedly thousands were killed in this event that went on for weeks. And Sidney was threatened by this at one point, since he was staying in Paris at the English embassy there. So after this, he would spend the next 2 years traveling between Germany and Italy, learning the language that he would need to be an emissary for the Queen. In 1576, he joins his father in Ireland. At this point, his father, Sir Henry Sidney, is serving his second term as Lord Deputy of Ireland, and Sidney is eager to get a reputation as a knight. So he's looking for battlefield valor, but he does not find it in Ireland. What he finds himself doing is engaging in frustrating and furtive skirmishes with Irish rebels, using guerrilla fighting tactics, not what Sidney imagined fighting to be like. He has a friendship with Walter Devereux that's developed at this point, who promises his daughter Penelope's hand in marriage. But as I explained earlier, a few months later, Devereux dies of dysentery, and the engagement falls apart after that. In 1577, he travels on the continent with his poet friends Edward Dyer and Fulk Greville. Greville was a friend of his from his Oxford days. And mainly he's traveling, engaged in various diplomatic missions for Queen Elizabeth amongst different Protestant groups in Europe. At this time, his sister Mary weds Henry Herbert, the second Earl of Pembroke. And then in 1580, just exhausted by court intrigue, a lot of this intrigue involving the Queen's various suitors and sort of disputes amongst the nobility about her marriage and about her succession. He gets out of this and retreats to his sister Mary's estate at Wilton House. And it's while he's there that he probably reconnects in some way with Penelope Devereux. He's writing poems, he's translating psalms, and he completes a long prose romance with some poetry interspersed throughout, known today as the Old Arcadia, and it's called the Old Arcadia because he would revise it and expand it later. Which we'll talk about in just a minute. But this really begins this period of just a few years from 1580 to 1584, 85 is when Sidney is most active writing poetry. In 1581, Penelope Devereux marries Robert Rich, and Sidney begins writing the songs and sonnets that will later be published as Astrophil and Stella. He also finishes what is probably the single most sustained and important piece of literary theory published during the Renaissance, and that is the Defense of Poesy, which we simply don't have time to read, unfortunately. In 1582, he begins a significant revision and expansion of Arcadia. This one is called the New Arcadia, which he was unable to finish. It's twice as long as the earlier version, but he could not finish it. He died fighting in the Low Countries. And in 83, he marries the 16-year-old Frances Walsingham. In 1585, England signs the Treaty of Nonsuch with the Dutch rebels, which basically commits England to helping the Dutch in their fight against their Spanish rulers. And Sidney, who is just on the verge of traveling to America, to colonize America. He is actually on one of Sir Francis Drake's ships at one point, and as they are setting sail, a messenger comes, and he's pulled off the ship and is appointed governor of Flushing in the Netherlands. And actually, this is a position that Sidney had coveted. He really wanted this position after seeing the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Back in 1572, he was eager to fight on the behalf of the Protestants, so he was very pleased to win this position. In the summer of 1586, both of Sidney's parents die just within a few months of each other. And then Sidney himself is shot in the thigh. He probably was not wearing what he should have been wearing in combat. He did not have on his thigh armor that he should have been wearing, and so he took a bullet to the leg while fighting the Spanish forces at the Battle of Zutphen. Zutphen was a Dutch city that was occupied by Spain, and the English and Dutch rebels were laying siege to the city, and there was a convoy of supplies and reinforcements coming in from Spain, and Sidney led an ambush on that convoy, and that's how he was injured. The wound became septic, and then a month later, a very slow and painful death for Sidney. A lot of stories came out of this episode. most of them glorifying Sidney, and many of them probably not true or only half true. This is the most famous one. This is an 18th century drawing by John Hamilton Mortimer, one of my favorite late 18th century artists. This shows Sidney on horseback right in the middle there, and he's being offered a canteen of water. He's hurt, and he says, no, there's this poor common soldier who's been hurt, and he needs it more than I do. You should give it to him. This is one of several stories surrounding Sidney's final days that glorify him and make him seem extra heroic and magnanimous. So after his death, a few years after his death, there began to be a push to publish his work. Greville worked with Spencer's publisher, William Ponsonby, to publish the incomplete New Arcadia. Sidney's widow married Robert Devereux in that same year. In 1591, there are several unauthorized editions of Astrophil and Stella. Here is one of those, Sir Philip Sidney, his Astrophil and Stella. You'll notice that it's spelled E-L here. That is, that's the old way of spelling it. Most scholars today prefer the I-L spelling, A-S-T-R-O-P-H-I-L, for a couple of reasons. One is it completes the Greek portmanteau word astrophil, which means star lover, aster meaning star in Greek, and phil meaning love. There's also the pun on Philip's name. So most scholars today prefer astrophil, and then Stella being the Latin word for star. So star lover and star. In 1595, under the Countess of Pembroke's direction, so Sidney's sister, Ponsonby publishes Arcadia. This consists of the New Arcadia, but this time completed with the last books of the Old Arcadia. So they're fused together, but it's a pretty messy it's a pretty messy conjoining of the two works. And I can't get into that here, but it is a big work and quite popular, and would be translated into just about every vernacular language in Europe at the time. It was immensely popular. The Defense of Poesy was also published for the first time in 1595. And then in 1598, probably the most important anthology of Sidney's work, the most important collection, the Countess of Pembroke's Arcadia. And this is the book that includes the authorized Astrophil and Stella and other early poems as well. And there is the title page for it. It's a gaudy title page. The porcupine you see up there, that was Sidney. That was an emblem of the family. And in it, there's the section that starts Astrophil and Stella. So that's how it looked in 1598. So the sonnets of Astrophil and Stella were likely written between 1580 and 1582, while Sidney was staying with his sister's family at Wilton House in southwest England. The sonnets memorialize his love for Penelope Devereux, to whom he was at one point engaged to be married. And as was often the case in this period, marriages amongst the nobility were typically arranged and were determined by economic as well as political factors. After Penelope's father, Walter Devereux, died in 1576, the arrangement with Sidney fell apart, and she was eventually compelled to marry Lord Rich in 1581, a marriage that did not end well, as I shared with you earlier. While there is plenty of textual evidence supporting Stella's identification with Penelope, that does not mean that the situations described in the poems necessarily refer to actual events. So the reader has to remember that Astrophil is a literary persona, and that his feelings are filtered through the highly stylized conventions of Petrarchan love poetry. Unpublished in Sidney's lifetime, the sonnets circulated in various manuscripts amongst the poet's family and literary associates, and that was not uncommon for the period, until the first unauthorized editions appeared in 1591. That was 5 years after Sidney's death. Like the Rima Sparsi, in which Petrarch's sonnets appear interspersed with longer canzoni or songs, Astrophil and Stella consists of 108 sonnets and 11 songs, nearly half of which appear between sonnets 86 and 87. The first song does not come until over halfway through the sequence, after sonnet 63, and the last song, the 11th one, appears after sonnet 104. So just to give you an idea of what these poems looked like when they circulated in manuscript, here is one album, a surviving album. This one is from roughly 1590, 1591, I believe. And inside we see the sonnets very beautifully written out. That's the first sonnet. I'll enlarge it a little bit. This album is in the library of the University of Edinburgh, and I like this. I like this one because you can see that the way it was written out. It's written in the English form of the 3 quatrains and the couplet. So there are 108 sonnets, like I said, and we're going to take a closer look at a dozen of these. 5 of them I'm going to look at I'm going to put up on the screen in full text for you to read. The others will be in your textbook. So we'll take a look at sonnet 1 first. So when Sidney began composing his sonnets around 1581, his primary models were, of course, the Rima Sparsi of Petrarch, as well as the sonnets of Wyatt and Surrey. The great sequences of the 1590s, obviously they came after. This first sonnet in Astrophil and Stella is in the English form of 3 quatrains and a couplet. The 6-foot hexameter lines in the sonnet continue Surrey's experimentation with longer lines in the sonnets that we see in Toddle's Miscellany, but they may owe something as well to Spenser's friend Gabriel Harvey, who was a very outspoken advocate for the hexameter line. Sidney's use of trochees and caesuri, lines 3 and 4, for example, makes this poem particularly pleasing to the ear, in my opinion. And perhaps because of these poetic influences, the influences of Surrey, of Petrarch, we see the poet in the 3rd quatrain really struggling to assert his originality, trying to get out from under others' feet, he says. And I think there's an obvious pun on feet there. And invent something fresh and genuine. And this is a process that he curiously describes using metaphors of pregnancy and childbirth. So here is sonnet number 7. So this sonnet, I chose this sonnet because I think it displays Sidney's really exceptional powers of invention using the common Petrarchan trope of a description of the beloved's eyes. In the first quatrain, he suggests that nature made Stella's eyes dark in color to reveal by contrast the brilliance of the mind and spirit projected through them. He then goes on to ask whether her eyes were not made black to make it easier for her admirers to look upon her refulgent beauty without being blinded by it, or if nature is just showing off, like Sidney in writing this poem, by creating superlative beauty out of something that is the very antithesis or negation of color and beauty. In the end, he arrives at the more conventional association of blackness with sorrow and death. Stella does not nourish or return Astrophil's love. He pines away, gazing into her eyes, where he sees himself and other admirers too reflected, as though he were dressed in mourning garb, grieving over the death of his love. When nature made her chief work, Stella's eyes, in color black, why wrapped she beams so bright? Would she, in beamy black, like painter wise, frame daintiest luster, mixed of shades and light? Or did she else that sober hue devise an object best to knit and strength our sight? Lest, if no veil these brave gleams did disguise, they, sunlike, should more dazzle than delight. Or would she her miraculous power show, that whereas black seems beauty's contrary, she, even in black, doth make all beauties flow? Both so, and thus, she, minding love should be placed ever there, gave him this morning weed, to honor all their deaths, who for her bleed. So this sonnet is typical of Sidney in that it uses the English sonnet, the three-quatrain rhyme scheme, A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, E, with the E, the couplet. But there are also Italianate features of the sonnet. So first, there's the repeated A and B rhymes in the first and second quatrain, which makes it an octave of 8 lines. The second Italianate feature of this is that the grammar of the final quatrain and couplet, I'll put an arrow in there to help identify this, separating lines 9 through 11, which are in the form of a question, from lines 12 through 14, answering the question, that effectively makes the final 6 lines into 2 tercets. Just in terms of grammar. So the rhyme pattern of the final 6 lines is that of an English sonnet, but the sense is structured more like an Italian sonnet, and that is very typical of Sidney's sonnets. Sonnet 21. That Sidney had a self-deprecating sense of humor is evidenced by this poem, which is addressed not to Stella, but a concerned friend who thinks Sidney is squandering his talents writing frivolous love poetry rather than aspiring to the great expectation of his social rank. Despite the playful irony of the closing couplet, the poem betrays the seriousness, I think, of the pressure that Sidney felt as a public figure, now in his mid-20s, to pursue nobler desires like the elder statesmen in his family, Robert Dudley and his father, Sir Henry Sidney. This pressure would eventually pull Sidney away from poetic endeavors and put him on a career path that would end with his premature death a few years later. In Sonnet 27, this is a more inward-looking poem than number 21, but it too shows Sidney reckoning with the incommensurability of his public and private lives. So he's unhappy in love, and so he comes across to others as distracted, aloof, and arrogant. In the poem, he states, "The rumor flies that poison foul of bubbling pride doth lie in my swelling breast." The truth, of course, is that his ambition is more personal in nature. He's thinking not so much about pleasing others as he does about pleasing Stella. So he puts love before public duty, which alienates him from greatest company. The implication here being that he's damaging his reputation and sabotaging his career for a woman he cannot have. Sonnet 30, I'll put this one up. Here we go. So, though Sidney, this is not one of Sidney's most dazzling displays of poetical skill, but Sonnet 30 is unusually topical, and it's the one sonnet in the sequence that's most closely and consistently linked to his life. He mentions his father, for example, Sir Henry Sidney, and his policies as Lord Deputy of Ireland in lines 9 and 10. In line 5, he mentions the religious divisions in France, which he had observed firsthand between the Catholics and the Protestant Huguenots and the moderates. Remember, he was there. He witnessed the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in person. He alludes to Dutch Protestants' loss of faith in King William of Orange, who had proven inept in challenging Spanish rule in lines 7 and 8. So his point, Sidney's point in the poem, is that while as a courtier, he is expected to have strong, informed opinions on foreign policy and current events, he is distracted by his love for Stella. When asked, I, cumbered with good manners, answer do, but know not how, for still I think of you, he says. Sonnet 45, we'll also put that one up. Stella oft sees the very face of woe painted in my beclouded, stormy face, but cannot skill to pity my disgrace, not though thereof the cause herself she know. Yet hearing late a fable which did show of lovers never known a grievous case, pity thereof got in her breast such place that from that sea derived tears spring did flow. Alas, if fancy, drawn by imaged things, though false, yet with free scope more grace doth breed than servants reck, where new doubts honor brings, then think, my dear, that you and me do read of lovers' ruin some sad tragedy. I am not I. Pity the tale of me. So this sonnet begins with a very conventional Petrarchan complaint. Stella sees my suffering, but she takes no pity on me. However, in a very clever turn in the next quatrain, Astrophil observes that she will burst into tears reading the fate of unhappy lovers and some fictional romance. Perhaps this is an allusion even to his own Arcadia, while remaining coldly unmoved by the very real heartbreak of which she is herself the cause. The wonderfully ironic solution that he proposes is that she might reciprocate his love if she would regard him not as a man, but as a character of romance. Then think, my dear, that you and me do read of lovers' ruin, some sad tragedy. I am not I, pity the tale of me. I think that's a particularly clever sonnet. In Sonnet 47, we see the poet struggling to overcome his love. I like this sonnet because of, in particular, because of the way Sidney uses his metrical effects. So, virtue awake, he commands, followed by a very confident, rapid-fire burst of iambs. I may, I must, I can, I will, I do. But then when Stella unexpectedly appears before him in the final tercet, his resolve deteriorates into halting measures. And you can note, for example, the grammatically emphatic caesura in line 13. It's like there's a lot of confidence right up to the end, and then his verse becomes more halting. And I find that to be a very clever effect. Sonnet 49. So number 49 is a good example of how the conciseness of the sonnet form allowed poets to display their eccentric wit with elaborate analogies and metaphors. So in this one, Astrophil, a skilled horseman, describes how love rides him like a horse. So all the rider's tack, the reins, the bit, the whip, or with the wand, it's called in the poem, the saddle, the spurs, become metaphors for his humbled thoughts, his reverence for Stella, his willpower, his fancy, and his desire. In the closing lines, the masochistic pleasure that he takes in love's cruelty is very typical of the Petrarchan lover. He sits me fast, however, I do stir, and now hath made me to his hand so right that in the manage myself takes delight. Sonnet 71. So in order for the poet's beloved to embody virtue, her beauty must be abstracted from sexual attraction and carnal desire. And this is a frequently recurring problem in Renaissance poetry. We've already seen it explored obsessively by Spenser in The Fairy Queen. Here, Sidney describes Stella's body as a book whose fair lines true goodness show, and Stella's inward sun of reason drives away the night birds of passion. And yet, for all his Petrarchan abstraction, in the end, he yields to his physical craving. And I think the final lines are actually quite funny. So while Stella's beauty draws the heart to love, as fast thy virtue bends that love to good. But desire still cries, give me some food. Sonnet 91. Number 91 is one of the so-called absence sonnets that start after that begin right after this batch of 5 songs or so. And Astrophil has been called away from Stella on some official state business. Once again, we see the conflict here between the poet's public duty and his private passion. And while visiting foreign courts, he encounters other beautiful women, he says, and he admits it. And he fancies to himself that Stella might become jealous, believing that his devotion to her has diminished in the presence of these ladies. And so he reassures her, and I think this is more an exercise in pleasing and reassuring himself, that their beauty is but a dim reflection of hers. They are, he says at one point, but wooden globes that map out the constellations, while Stella is herself the full expanse of the heavens above. Stella, while now by honor's cruel might I am from you, light of my life, misled, and that fair you, my son, thus overspread with absence veil, I live in sorrow's night. If this dark place yet show like candlelight some beauty's piece, as amber-colored head, milk hands, rose cheeks, or lips more sweet, more red, or seeing jets, black, but in blackness bright, they please, I do confess, they please mine eyes. But why? Because of you they models be. Models such be wood globes of glistering skies. Dear, therefore be not jealous over me. If you hear that they seem my heart to move, not them, oh no, but you in them I love. In Sonnet 98, taken as a whole, the sonnets of Astrophil and Stella do not form a coherent linear plot, but small clusters of them appear to have been placed together deliberately. So, for example, number 87 is the first in a series addressing Astrophil's prolonged separation from Stella, and we looked at one in that series. Number 91 is one of those, where he says, compelled by iron laws of duty to depart, he must leave her behind to attend to affairs of state. Sonnet 98, this sonnet, belongs to another cluster of poems that share the theme of insomnia. So here, Astrophil's bed becomes an instrument of torture. He lies sleepless in what he calls tedious leisure, like he's just bored out of his mind, lying there in the dark, contemplating his miseries, woe's black face, he says. And then only with the arrival of dawn does he finally fall asleep, which he says is to spite the world that gets to enjoy the sun while he does not get to enjoy his sunshine. So for spite, perchance, that worms should have their sun, and I want mine, he says. So finally, the last sonnet in the sequence. It's not a particularly impressive sonnet, but in a way, I think it's deliberate. So this is the last one, and it shows Astrophil no better off than he was at the beginning. There's a kind of futility in this last sonnet. Stella still refuses him. He suffers piteously for it, with little reason to hope for any more favorable outcome in the future. It's a very hopeless sonnet. It ends with the kind of pithy, paradoxical exclamation that is very typical of heartsick Petrarchan suitors. In my woes for thee, thou art my joy, he says, and in my joys for thee, my only annoy. So in certain respects, The Italianate ABBA, ABBA octave, the exhausted metaphorical language. There's really nothing very original in here. One might regard this last sonnet then as the poet's white flag of surrender, the kind of uninspired Petrarchan imitation that Sidney studiously set out to avoid when he wrote the first sonnet in the sequence. And that brings us to the end here. This image is from an album of engravings by the Dutch artist Thomas Lant that commemorated Sidney's funeral in February of 1587, which was extraordinarily lavish and theatrical and carefully choreographed, very expensive public service. In this image taken from the series, we see a page sitting astride Sidney's horse, carrying an inverted battle axe, a symbol of Sidney's death.